The Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. It was ratified in 1863. The Civil War was still going on. So what did free the slaves? It was something that we still see in our Constitution called the 13th Amendment. And if you read the 13th Amendment, it abolished slavery with one exception in particular. The one instance where slavery was not abolished for those who commit felonies. The 13th Amendment does not apply. This was ratified in 1865. Not long after that, in 1868, you had the 14th Amendment that gave equal opportunity to the former slave. It's interesting because the 14th Amendment has been applied more for corporations as opposed to African Americans. So corporations are considered living entities with certain rights. And finally, in 1870, you had the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was to guarantee slaves, or former slaves, I should say, the right to vote. Notice the dates of those amendments, constitutional amendments, still in there. 1865, 1868, 1870. And you may wonder, but wait a minute, African Americans, they dealt with sharecropping, which was a form of slavery. They dealt with the rise of chain gangs and whatnot. And they dealt with fighting for equal rights and Jim Crow. And they had to fight for the right to vote all over again. And you would be right to say that, because they had to fight for something that was given in the Constitution for almost 100 years. So everything that we saw in the 1900s and the 1960s and all that, all these marches and everything was already given in the Constitution. So you saw African Americans being hanged. By this time, I should also mention, I believe it was 1868, we had this group that was established called the Ku Klux Klan in Pulaski County, Tennessee. And the words Ku Klux comes from the Greek, which means ku klos. That means circle. This was started by 6 Confederate soldiers, one of which was Nathan Bedford Forrest. And this idea of white knights, they ran opposite of what was happening in terms of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the time period that took place after the Civil War. So, of course, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. This is during the time of Reconstruction. But we had a big presidency, and this guy, Rutherford B. Hayes, ran for presidency. And there was a big scandal. There was a big debate. There was a lot of heated discussions, almost on the brink of war all over again. The speculation was there was a miscount in the vote. And so there was a fear that there would be another civil war. So as a result, there was something called the Compromise of 1877. In the Compromise of 1877, all the federal soldiers that were stationed throughout the South in order to protect the former slaves, they were removed from the South. So all those amendments that we were talking about and the rights that were given to the former slaves, there was no law to really enforce that in the South. So you began to quickly see the end of Reconstruction. It's barely a blip. You really don't hear much talk about it. During Black History Month, you don't really hear much talk about Reconstruction. It was a very short period. And you find at the end of Reconstruction, all those things that were given in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were fought for all over again. All over again. In 1964, you had the Civil Rights Act, and in 1965, you had the Voting Rights Act. So African Americans had to fight all over for something that was in the Constitution. Something that was already in the Constitution was fought for almost 100 years to be solidified. It seems like that was a step down. Most people, we don't really talk about that. Also during this time in the 1800s, you had in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. That's where you had the idea of the one drop club, and you had the whole idea of separate but equal. So basically, if I mention the Ku Klux Klan, if I mention the Plessy versus Ferguson decision and the one drop club and separate but equal, that violates the 14th Amendment, equal opportunity. See, now you got white water fountains, black or colored water fountains, and different parts of the bus you can sit on and whatnot. 14th Amendment. If you look at the Voting Rights Act and you look at the fight for the right to vote all over again and how African Americans were killed, and you had not only black folks, you had black and white folks that were killed. Whether you look at the Congress of Racial Equality, whether you look at the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, whether you look at the Freedom Riders, whether you look at the different marches, whether you look at Edmund Pettus Bridge, whether you look at Bloody Sunday, You had a continuation for people who were already given their rights, but they're terrorized for 100 years. For rights that was already in the Constitution, separate but equal, violated the 14th Amendment. Sharecropping, forced labor, because sharecropping was a system in which African Americans had to work the land and they got paid a little bit, but the money they got paid, they wound up having to pay for rent and the charges that they were accruing during the time that they were working in the fields. So it was pretty much slavery all over again. And the right to vote. Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was fighting for his right to vote, and he was killed while trying to protect his mother and grandfather. And this is during the time just prior to the Edmund Pettus March and the March for the Right to Vote. You had this woman who's from the North, and she came down and she would give black folks rides to and from the voting polls. And she was killed. Her name was Viola Liuzzo. You had people all over the world seeing African Americans had to fight all over again for rights that were already in the Constitution. And if you look at the assassination of Dr. King, and you look at Robert Kennedy, whether you look at Malcolm X, whether you look at what happened with a lot of the leaders within this movement, it's interesting that prior to their assassinations, prior to their death, the media coverage showed African Americans being nonviolent people who were trying to get somewhere peacefully. But it's interesting, though, since the death of those leaders, you seem to have a concerted effort of African Americans being depicted, instead of being the most peaceful group trying to get somewhere, to now being considered one of the most violent groups. And it seems like there's a great effort to portray African Americans in such manner, whether you look at the news, whether you listen to music, whatnot. There's such great effort. Speaking of which, that almost reminds me of the first full-length motion picture, which was called The Birth of a Nation, where the heroes were the Ku Klux Klan. Who were the villains? You got it, black folks. So what we see today is the continuation of The Birth of a Nation, the portrayal of African Americans being villainous or playing subjugated characters. The fact of the matter remains, how do we come from being considered in less than 60 years, in less than 6 decades, we came from being considered a peaceful, non-violent group who was trying to be successful in society, to now being considered the world's pariah that wreaks havoc in every community that we walk into. How did that happen in just 60 years? How? How did our script, how did our characterization in this movie we call life change so much in America? Well, happy Black History.